So students, after milling of wheat flour, today we are going to look into how bread is made, or more specifically, we can see the science and technology of bread. Okay, so when you look at this picture, what do you see? You see a woman is eating the wheat flour. How does it feel, or how does it look like? It feels like, oh my gosh, do you feel yucky? You say what is this? Why? So let me ask you one question. Why are you wasting our time? Why do we eat bread? Anyone, a quick one or two answers can I hear from the audiences, from the students? Why do we eat bread? Why can't we just eat wheat flour? It's just obtained from the milling factory and just eat, because fermentation of the bread itself is such a lengthy procedure and it takes so much of time. So why can't we eat wheat flour instead of wasting so much of time and making bread?
Ma'am, wheat flour is not palatable. If we were to just eat the dry powder, we will choke because it is so dry. In bread is easily palatable, we can eat it with lot of different things.
Excellent. So bread you like because it is more palatable, more digestible, and then wheat flour eating is dry. Okay. So somebody said, okay, I will pour some water, make a porridge or slurry. Will you then still eat it? Even then, I am sure you will not like it. Okay. Okay. So let me pose another question. Why do you like bread? So
We can have it with lot of things like with butter, with chutney, jam, and it is, but with everything it tastes good.
wow. So I take your last keyword. It tastes so good. It tastes so good, and not only taste. Do you think its texture is also very good? The soft texture, attracts us. If the bread wouldn't have been so soft, we would not have eaten on daily basis. Okay. So its texture, its softness, and in addition to about that, it is very tasty. So why do we eat bread? Let me quickly give you an idea. Because we need an instant energy. It Bread is a staple. Why it is called as a staple? Because it has a starch, and then starch gives you an instant energy. Starch gets broken down. Amylase in our body or enzymes breaks down the starch and gives the glucose as a source of energy. So for food purpose we eat the bread, and of course for getting the nutritional value in terms of energy, like sometimes there are variety of bread like fruit bread or some kind of other bread. So basically it gives us a quick energy. And just now you said that you can eat it with butter, you can eat it with jam, you can eat it with cheese slices, or you can make a cheese toast, omelette, and so many variants could be eaten, and it is so convenient. You have to just take the slices and eat it up. It also has a protein, because wheat has some amount of protein. So if you combine, and nowadays there are other type of breads available which are rich in protein, but additionally if you combine it with the cheese, or paneer, or if you combine it with omelette or any non-vegetarian or vegetarian proteins, it's really a good source of protein, including its own protein in the form of gluten. Okay. So that is what was my question. Because when you ferment the wheat flour, you lose upon the energy, you lose upon the starch, because then starch is eaten by the yeast, and then it converts into carbon dioxide gas to live on the bread. So So basically, from the research, it has been found, and it is a very well known fact now, that the 3% of the flour is converted into gas and wasted in terms of nutrition for the yeast. So we feed yeast rather than feeding ourselves. But then, since we have discussed already that we love the texture, we love the taste, we love the flavor, aroma, maybe sometimes color, and that is why we do all this stuff like fermentation. So we all go into this trouble and convert this wheat flour slurry or dough. Slurry I'm calling because there is a novel or newer type of bread. It's not novel because sometimes we scientists what we do old is gold kind of thing we accept. So sourdough bread, which was one of the most traditional bread making process, and then in between due to modernization and modern procedures of bread, the original sourdough recipe or procedure was lost, in which one prepares a batter or one prepares slurry, and that's how the bread is formed from the slurry. So basically we are doing all this stuff because during the bread making process there is a very important stage called as a fermentation, and then fermentation adds the nutritional value as well as the flavor, aroma, texture to the final bread. So we like the raised bread, its texture, its appearance of aerated baked bread, unique property. And why you get that uh, spongy texture, it allows the aerated structure. No other grain or flour. I have been insisting since last many lectures that the wheat flour is very unique in nature because it allows the aerated structure because of the protein called as a gluten. As such, gluten is not present in the wheat. There is a gliadin and gluteline, and together glutenine, and when you add water, and then only in presence of water the gliadin and glutenine comes together and they form an viscoelastic network which is able to retain the gas during rising without premature rupturing, without rupturing. So there are a lot of functions of bread making process. One is, as some of you have already said, that it gives a palatability. It gives you a palatable food instead of eating, porridge or flour. You will not eat. Suppose you will eat only for one day, but then later on you will not like it. The digestibility is improved. So the steps, there are lot of steps. Lot of means there are sub steps, and today I will be discussing all those steps. But believe me, initially when you try to bake a bread, you will find it difficult because it's a skill, it's an art. But then once you grab that skill, or once you understand the science into it, bread making or baking is one of the most simplest procedure. You will bake the bread again and again and enjoy it. And baking a fresh bread at home and enjoying it is like heavenly. It's really tasty and wonderful. Okay, so the development of gluten structure, that is hydrated protein in the dough, through the application of energy during mixing. So I'm saying here during, it's not a normal. See, baking a bread at home, in the entire bread making, the mixing of the dough is very, very important. If you want to have a soft, uniform texture to the bread, the dough mixing of the bread is very, very important. Of course, in the commercial scale, there are mixers, there are machines available which do the job perfectly. Okay, and at home we call it as a kneading, but it plays a very, very crucial role on the final quality of the bread. If your kneading or if your mixing is inappropriate or of not a good quality, you will not get either a soft textured bread, or you will get a hard bread, or you will not get that jolly. You will feel like, oh, I'm eating just a cooked dough. So you won't be able to enjoy. Okay, we will discuss that each step and in detail. So basically what you do, you are incorporating the air bubble. Let me connect my so so basically you have a gluten in which you are trying to incorporate the air bubbles and within the dough during the mixing. The continued development of gluten structure created as a result of kneading. So kneading or mixing or incorporating the air bubble is very very important in order to modify the rheological property of dough and to improve the ability to expand when the gas pressure increases, because the carbon dioxide that is generated in the fermentation of the dough expands. I will explain this in the next figure. I have those figures. Okay, so this is just an introductory, and then once you have a fermented dough, what do, you divide that dough, and then you do the shaping, modification of the shape of the divided dough pieces. Then you allow it to rest, because even the resting of the dough during baking is very very important. Shaping of the dough pieces to achieve the required configuration, the fermentation and expansion of the shaped dough pieces during the proofing. So there is one more stage called as a proofing, then further expansion of the dough pieces and fixation of the final bread structure. Okay, so overall if you see, there are various methods: traditional bulk fermentation process or mechanical dough development method. One cannot bake a very huge bread with hand, because it's not so easy to knead the dough and in a large scale. And then that is why the mechanical dough development processes have been developed, or the combination of traditional bulk fermentation process and mechanical dough development process to retain more flavor, more taste and more modified texture. This is the new method that is being followed currently all over the world. It is called as a Corleywood bread process, CBD process. Okay, the traditional bulk process, that is a fermentation process, basically here it's the name indicates itself. It's a traditional process. It's a bulk fermentation, like you're fermenting the dough in a very bulk quantity. So the dough mass is allowed to ferment over a long period. And since it is a traditional process, you don't try to accelerate the fermentation process, because you are allowing the natural fermentation. So it takes a longer time, and generally in commercial process, people have found these methods wherein, because of use of the mechanical agitation or mechanical forces, the fermentation could be accelerated. So here the disadvantage or discontinuation of this process is basically long time. But because also recently one of my student have herself worked on traditional like sourdough process, in which we have tried to prepare the bread from a sourdough like process. It takes really a long time to ferment the dough. So But then during this natural fermentation process, since it is takes longer period and also it is natural, more natural acids are produced like organic acid. And then when you taste this traditionally fermented bread, it's more tastier, and that is why this bread is now in more demand. Maybe some of you must have tasted the sourdough bread. So there are three essential features: mixing of ingredient at slow speed, that is to make dough very homogeneous. Then you allow the resting of the dough in the bulk. Okay, you haven't yet divided for the period of 1 to 3 hours. I will be explaining later when we enter into fermentation what is the disadvantage of fermenting the dough individually and then in bulk. Okay, what happens when you ferment in bulk? In its effect on especially the final low volume and spongy texture. Okay, so during this 1 to 3 hour of time, yeast ferments to inflate the dough. Literally the dough inflates, having lots of gas bubbles inside. Okay, bread dough. Remixing of dough part way through the bulk fermentation to remove the most. So because it is a natural process in which you have allowed the dough to have this bigger glass bubble. Okay, so what you do later on, you do try to remove this bigger gas, because then there is a lot of carbon dioxide and these cells are formed. So you, whatever is large quantity of gas produced, it increases the number of gas cells. Okay, these are called as a gas cells. And when you try to heat, because there are gluten strand and there is a carbon dioxide inside, and then according to Edmond-Millman formula, as the temperature increases, the pressure is built up, and then that is why the volume also increases. But then since this gluten network that is present in and around does not allow the to expand it further, and due to the high temperature of more than 200 or almost 180 or 200 degrees Celsius, this escapes. Okay, this gas escapes, or the vapors are escaped, and then you get that spongy texture. Okay, then therefore what is these, if you have these big cells, and then if you bake it, what will happen? The bread slice that will be formed will have big holes, like not the small jelly. Okay, it will not be uniform spongy texture, you will have the big holes. So what in the traditional process is done? Due to this knock back, like you knock it, okay, you press it, you punch it, and you remove this excess of the carbon dioxide, or the bigger vacuole cells are reduced in the size. So, and then the bulk fermentation, or this traditional fermentation process, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of flavoring compounds produced because it's a natural process, and primarily for developing the dough protein structure, and it is like it's a very good process which retains the gas, and it also retards the coalescence, means falling of the or breakage of the gas cells. I just now showed these gas cells. If these gas cells coalescence or breaks down, then your bread will not have a uniform spongy texture. So it's very important. So gas cells must be incorporated into the dough during mixing to act as a nucleation sites. Like one nucleation site should be provided so that other gas cells to be formed. Okay, so without these nucleation sites, carbon dioxide has nowhere within the dough to diffuse. This is a very important stage. How the carbon dioxide, because you have this yeast cell. Okay, you have this one yeast cell, suppose. Okay, what happens? This one yeast cell, simultaneously in and around there is a sugar or starch. So this yeast eats this sugar or starch and multiply. Okay, so then there are 3 cells, yeast cells or 4 cells. So this has multiplied, and then simultaneously as a byproduct there is a CO2, as well as there is gases like organic acid or flavoring compounds or alcohol is produced. Okay, so these, there should be there should be some spaces within the dough to diffuse the carbon dioxide that is produced. Okay, then there are other methods like sponge and dough. Again, the name itself, like part of the dough formulation receives. So when you ferment a dough, it becomes like a sponge, because these gas vacuoles or cells are formed because of the fermentation. It becomes like a sponge. So in this sponge and dough method, what is there? Basically initially a part of the dough formulation received a prolonged fermentation. Okay, and you take that fermentation, it's like a mother culture, like how we do it at home. Curd preparation, we take a small quantity of curd and put it in the milk. Okay, and then the milk is fermented. Like here you have this fermented dough which is called as a sponge, which is fermented for long, so that the yeast cells in that has grown in number. It's a fermented mass, and then you add that into new mass and then mix it, and so that you try to accelerate. Okay, it's like for rapid processing, where either a very short then there is another method like mechanical dough development process. In the mechanical dough development process, as I mentioned, like during mixing, it's a very very important function of mixing. You need to accelerate the fermentation. So how will you accelerate the fermentation? So you can use the mixer or divider or some mechanization to enhance or accelerate the fermentation. Salt, see, in the bread there are basic ingredients like you need a wheat flour, you need a water, you need an yeast, and then you need salt. So these are the 4 basic essential ingredients: wheat flour, salt, water and yeast. Okay, water and yeast. So these are very very important. But then salt we add for taste purpose, but then this salt does not allow the yeast cell to grow rapidly. It inhibits the growth rapidly. So there are protocols or there are recipes to enhance the or to accelerate the fermentation of the bread. What some people do, they add salt on the later stages, or they do not add salt, so that the fermentation is accelerated. So there are many recipes available. I will be sharing one recipe which was developed by my own student who had worked on a functional bread, and what all ingredients being used. So for the typical bulk fermentation dough, you need first 3-hour fermentation. You take 100% flour, or if you have a rapid so you combine this bulk fermented dough with the fresh dough which is just fermented for 1 hour, and then combine this more fermented dough together. Yeast concentration is different for the rapid fermented dough and the bulk fermented dough. Like if you see here, if you have more yeast, the fermentation will be rapid, but this will not give you a good, tasty, uniform, spongy textured dough, because you are accelerating it. And then but then if you add you know the basic rules of fermentation, whatever is in optimum concentration gives rise to or leads to good taste, good flavor, because you need to give a natural time. In case of curd, because generally in India we do not prepare bread at home. We get it, you bring it from the market, but then unlike India has that chapati, which is unleavened flat bread. Unlike India and other Western countries, and some of the countries in which I lived recently, they don't eat unfermented things. So for them, making this fermented dough is very simple. Sometimes I have seen at the home, people keep this fermented mother culture in containers, and then they keep using it and mixing it as a mother culture to speed up the process of the fermentation, so that a natural flavor or natural taste could be taken, because as such it takes, if you want a natural flavor, it is going to take 3 hours. Okay, the water level varies little bit. Okay, and then as I told you, these are the four basic ingredients. You need a flour which has an appropriate amount of gluten. Okay, if you try to bake a bread from rice, will not happen, or some other flour, non-gluten flour, then it will not. A flour with an appropriate gluten content is important. Then you have salt, yeast. Also in yeast, you need to have an yeast which is active, and appropriate quantity of water. We will see the role and function of each of the ingredient in detail. Okay. Then there are optional ingredients that are being added nowadays in the bread to improve its quality. For example, fat or butter or ghee or fat-like ingredients are being added in the percentage of 1 to 2% of the total flour weight. And these ingredients like fat helps in gas retention. It improves the crumb softness. You understand, crumb means the white portion, crust means the brown portion. Okay. Then emulsifier like GMS, glyceryl monostearate, or sodium stearyl lactylate, or datum, or lecithin in the concentration of 0.1 to 0.3 are being added. They also help in gas retention and crumb softness. Enzyme active flours are being added in the form of malt or malt flour or some other flours. It is called as just active flour. So they are added to, added as a source of enzyme. Like that malted flours or enzyme active flour, which has enzyme which will enhance the production of sugar, and if you have more sugar, the yeast will eat it up, and then yeast will produce carbon dioxide, and also it will add to the color, taste. So gas production. When will the gas produce? When the yeast will eat the sugar. How the sugar will be produced? It's an indirect effect. How the sugar will be produced? If yeast has easily available sugar. From where the sugar will come? From these enzyme active malt flour. It is not coming directly from the enzyme active flour. Enzyme active flour will have enzymes. The enzymes will act on the starch or the other ingredient, and then it will convert them into smaller units like dextrins, and then it can be easily converted into carbon dioxide by the yeast. Crust color, if you have more sugar, it will cause the Maillard reaction, and the Maillard reaction or browning, it causes a Maillard reaction because when sugar at higher temperature comes in reaction with the protein, because already there are proteins, so it causes a Maillard reaction, and it is also called as a caramelization. It causes at certain level, not fully, a crust color is formed. You love the crust outside portion of the bread slice, the brown portion of the bread slice. Sometimes enzyme active soya flour is added because this soya flour has a special enzyme called as a lipase, or certain enzymes which will act as a bleaching agent. They will remove the carotenoids that are present in the bran or some flour. So these bleaching of the pigment is carried by some special enzyme that is present. So this results into a crumb whiteness. Skim milk powder is again added to the whiteness of the bread or flavor, or also it results into texture. Sponge dough process, I have explained that sponge is taken and fermented. Role of sponge is basically the main role is to modify the flour, because sponge dough is like you are taking the sponge of the dough, or dough is converted into sponge by fermentation process, because you know it is a slow process. It's a natural fermented dough. It contributes to the development of the final dough through the modification of its biological property. It generates an acidic flavor arising from the slow fermentation process, okay, that is added by the yeast due to the natural fermentation process, okay. To maintain the right flavor profile in the finished product, sponge fermentation condition should be closely controlled. Otherwise what will happen, you'll have, you know, the excess fermented dough, wherein, you know, more acid will be produced, and then too much of acid will also not good. Sponge dough, it's just yeah, this is the generic ingredients that are being used in any bread in the entire country or different places. You take refined white wheat flour 100%, in which you add water 58%, salt 1.5%, yeast 2.5%, sugar around 2.5% is enough. Shortening or vegetable oil is 1.5. If you use too much, it is not good. It will inhibit the yeast. Glyceryl monostearate, GMS, at the rate of 0.5%. Calcium propionate, it's a preservative. It will prevent the mold growth, because you know, because of the water activity, because of the moisture that is present in the bread, the bread may get spoiled easily. So calcium propionate is used as a preservative, okay. Milk solids are added for the crumb whitening or the taste or flavor purpose. So the total weight is on the a total weight, okay. So you are not minusing anything, like there is another method, but that doesn't give you a correct calculation of the ingredient, that correct recipe. Like sometimes people, you know, minus everything. Like if you take salt 1.5, they minus that 1.58 from the 100, so it becomes like 99 98.5 or something like that. But this according to this protocol, you take the total weight as, you know, addition of all the weightage. This I will come back later. So what you do, you procure all the ingredient, you weigh all the ingredient, you all prepare everything. You knead the dough and you ferment the dough, and then, you know, you divide the dough, you do rounding and intermediate proofing. I will be taking each and every step in much detail, discussing on physical and chemical and all biochemical changes that take place. Then you have molding, panning, second proofing, which is done at 55 to 56 minutes. You see the time that is being required at every stage for a natural you know, bread making. Then only you will get this kind of a good bread. And then when you are trying to proof or ferment, you need to monitor or maintain a specific temperature, so that, and at every stage of this, you see, the yeast is in active form. Yeast is alive. So yeast should be alive, and the temperature plays a very important role. If you do not have the yeast in a live condition, you will not you know, get the correct bread. And also the humidity, that is moisture, because otherwise what will happen, the dough becomes too much of dry, and then it inhibits the growth. So an appropriate amount of moisture in the bread plays a very important role. Even the baking temperature plays an important role, time plays the important role. Even a few degrees Celsius of, you know, fluctuation in the temperature results into a very hard bread. Maybe, you know, it will become like too much of hard, or not the spongy one, or crumble, or it will stale very fast. And cooling and slicing, so every step, even the cooling has an important process. So yeah, so this is basically a Collywood bread process, which was developed in 1961 by the British baking industry. Research Association. It is based at Hollywood, and from that process, the name has come to Corleywood bread process. So compared to the traditional bulk fermentation process, the CBP is like requires shorter time, and even sometimes in UK especially there are varieties of wheat which has a lower protein, and then even it can work at the lower protein. If you have a higher protein, then it should not be a problem. But even at a lower protein wheat, this process is able to give you a good quality of bread. So there are basically 11 steps in bread making process. First step is mixing. Of course, you are before mixing also there is one important step, gathering of the ingredients. So you need to bring all the ingredients, and when you want to gather all the ingredients, you need to think what type of bread you are going to make. Is it a sandwich bread, or is it a simple bread? Is it a whole wheat bread? Is it a fruity bread, or what type of? There are so many type of bread. So based on that, but then as I mentioned before, there are 4 basic ingredients that are must. That is whole wheat white flour, salt, water, and yeast. And then you do mixing. Then once you do mix and form a dough, you divide it. Okay, you divide it, and then you round it. As I'm reading it, just dividing, rounding. It is not that easy, just dividing or rounding. After you round off, you have a process called as a first proof or more fermentation. Okay, first fermentation. Then there is a next step called as a molding. Okay, it is also called as a flour piecing, or you are putting the fermented dough into panning, and this process also has a very, very significant role. Then once you put the fermented dough into pan, you have a final proof, or it is called as also second proof, or it is also called as a second fermentation. And then later on, what you do, take those pan and put it in the oven. Okay, you put it in the oven, and then you bake it. Then you depan it, you cool it, and slice it. So let us understand what is the role of ingredients in the bread. As I mentioned before, yeast plays a very, very, very important role. If you do not have yeast of a good quality, your bread will not live on. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae variety yeast is being used in the bread very, very widely, and it is also called as a biological living agent. In the market, you must have seen there are different types of yeast. You get a granulated yeast, or it is also called as a dry yeast, and also there commercially there is one yeast which is used. It is called as a wet yeast. Wet yeast is like a more active, but it doesn't have that long shelf life, which is just mass, like it's just a kind of a mass, and whereas the dry granulated yeast is a granule or dried yeast which has a longer shelf life. Okay, so there are factors that are affect on the bread quality. Yeast level significantly affect. If you have too less of yeast, your bread dough will not ferment. If you have too much of yeast, you will have uncontrolled fermentation, and then uncontrolled spongy dough, and then you will have just big vacuoles and big holes in the bread slice. Also, the dough temperature. Suppose you prepare a dough, and if you do not put it at the temperature at which yeast has its optimum growth temperature. See, yeast is a biological living agent. Obviously, it will have a specific temperature, or it needs a specific temperature. If the temperature is 25 degrees Celsius, see, it is not dying. The yeast is not dying. It will act, but it will act very very slowly. If you have very high temperature, what will happen? It will, speeden up its process of multiplication, and it will eat up the sugar or eat up the starch without producing the flavoring compound like organic acid or alcohol. So the temperature plays a very important, because if you have an optimum temperature, then it will slowly produce all the organic acids or alcohol. Okay, so between 37 to 40 degrees Celsius or 45 degrees Celsius temperature is optimum for growth, and that really affects on the quality of the bread. Then the next important ingredient is flour. If some of you want to take a water break, you can take. I'm just taking just 2 minutes water break. So flour plays a very important role in bread making. And why flour? I have mentioned you in it several times that wheat flour with a high protein up to 12% content is generally being used for bread making, and it contains two main protein fractions like glutenin and gliadin, and when these are mixed with the water, gluten forms and they contribute to the dough strength. Formation of gluten creates an elastic extensible matrix. High quality gluten entraps. If you have, in the wheat flour also, good quality flour, when you have a good quality gluten, which is able to which has a very good strength, which is able to entrap the large amount of carbon dioxide produced by the yeast during the fermentation, is called as a good quality flour. Okay, then you have water. Water helps to form a gluten in dough, and gelatinization is very important step. We have already seen, because gelatinization, and wheat flour has a starch around 65 to 70% in the starch. So to achieve standard dough consistency, you need a good amount of water, good quality of water. Good quality means if you use too much of hard water, also it affects on the color, taste, and also fermentation. Hard water means too many of salt or too much of minerals. So it will inhibit the growth of yeast, or it will not be uh, it will not lead to a good taste. Sometimes very hard water leads to off flavor or off odor. So, and too much of water, if you use, the dough will become too sticky that the one is not able to handle it. Okay, so to obtain an appropriate dough consistency, you need a water. It also affects the bulk fermentation time, like fermentation time. Salt contributes to the flavor, significant effect on osmotic pressure of yeast cell, and so can be used to control the rate of fermentation. Very, very important. Okay, salt is for flavor contribution, but it also can be used to control the growth of yeast. Yeah, so then you have sugar. You have sugar being used to produce the like, as I mentioned, sugar acts as a food for yeast, but additionally it gives the sweetness to the bread, and also it causes the browning reaction or Maillard reaction, and thus helps in crust. See, imagine if you do not have a bread without a crust, will you like it? You will not like. And that is why baking plays a very important role, and that too which type of baking: conduction baking, convection baking. Sometimes just if you microwave the dough, it will sponge, but then it will not form a crust. So when you have a traditional oven, in that, at that high temperature, it will form a crust color. So crust is very important for the bread. One cannot imagine the bread without the crust. Okay. Fat is being used to retain the gas of the dough, the gas that is produced by the yeast inside the dough, and that is why it increases the volume, and that is why you get the bread texture, softness. Also, sometimes special fat, like if you use butter, it prevents the staling in the bread or crumbling in the bread. It adds shelf life to the bread. It also adds taste to the bread. Okay. Then you have emulsifiers. Emulsifiers basically helps in inhibiting the staling. It helps in retaining the gas more. It improves the crumb. Okay, crumb. Yes.
I have a doubt.
Yeah, please ask.
How do plants affect the shelf life? That is, you said it delays staling of bread.
I am sorry, I was unable to hear your question. You mean to say fat, how it is used in staling of the bread?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a separate slide in detail. I'm going to explain. This is just a beginning. So good question. So fat helps in staling of the bread. I will explain it in more detail, how it adds to the softness. I have a separate slide. Okay, just wait. So mold inhibitor, as I told you before, calcium propionate is a very, very common and oftenly used as a inhibitor of the mold. Coming to the first stage called as a mixing. Mixing is a very, very, once you have decided what type of bread you are going to make, you gather all the ingredients, you follow the recipe, because following recipe is very important as per the table that I showed you before. Take the ingredient in proportion. Too much of yeast or too much of salt or too much of water is not going to give you. So once you decide on the ingredient and their levels, their quantity, mixing is a very, very important process. It is the process in which all the ingredients are put together in a right proportion for a dough formation. Okay. These ingredients are then, in a commercial bread making process, they are fed into big and huge mixers. Okay, where mixing is done where mixing is done and dough is prepared for molding. So major ingredients are flour, fat nowadays, or sugar is generally added. Okay, so these are the basic ingredients that one would like to have. So there are, various stages mixing can be done in. So like if you have, enough time, or you want to prepare a bread with more flavor, so either mixing can be done in 1 stage or 2 stage or 3 stage. Commercially, a combination of all these mixing processes are being followed. Okay, so 1 stage, the name as such indicates 1 stage means सब कुछ एक साथ ले लो, मिक्स करो, हो गया, डो बना दो, उसको फर्मेंट कर दो. Okay, is a type of mixing where all ingredient and water are added. But then, sometimes mixing everything together doesn't give an appropriate time to form the dough, an appropriate time or environment to the yeast to develop. So एक एक करके एक एक ingredient डालोगे तो दूसरे को उसका मतलब फायदा होगा. Like it's like very useful. Suppose if you're making bread, if you add other ingredients later on, okay, for example, if you take only yeast and wheat flour, so fermentation will take place. So sugar, milk powder, if you are later on or later stage of the mixing, so it has a different role, because the starch is a granule, okay, starch, and in the wheat you have these gliadin molecule, and then this is gliadin, okay, and then you have this glutenin, okay, this is a glutenin, okay. So when water is added, suppose you add this water, okay, H2O, so what happens? So these gliadin and glutenin comes together and they form an viscoelastic mass. Okay. So once this gliadin, and also there is a starch abundantly present, which is embedded, gliadin, glutenin, or gluten is embedded into the starch. So suppose if you add fat, okay, in the later on stage, first if you are, and that is why as a baker or as a scientist, there are different types of products that could be formed. Suppose you want to not to develop this gluten, you do not want the long gluten strand. Okay, what will you do? Immediately you add everything. Suppose you have this is the blender, let me use the okay. So this is a gliadin. This is the gliadin and this is the glutenin. And when you add water, what happens? The gliadin and the glutenin comes together and they forms the dough. Okay, they forms the dough. So you are doing, then once the dough is formed, Suppose I'm giving you an example. If you take all the ingredient and mix together, like इसमें fat भी लिया है, water भी लिया है, what are you doing here? In between the fat will go and it will also form a layer without allowing it to form into a strong gluten. So gluten का ये जो लंबा strands है, वो कट हो जाता है. It gets broken, it breaks. So that is why it is called as shortenings are being used. So that shortens the strands. This shortening is needed when you do not want the dough development or you do not want a spongy texture. Okay, you don't want a spongy texture. Okay, for example, जब हम donuts बनाते हैं, in the donuts the objective is not to have a spongy bread. Okay, so you add fat immediately, like during the mixing only. But in case of bread, we want the bread to have a maximum strength to entrap these gas cells. So what you do, you allow the dough to develop. How the dough will develop? So you have this gluten, gliadin and glutenin, which will in presence of water form gluten. Okay, so the gluten is formed. So in this gluten, when you put the mixing forces slowly during the mixing process, what happens? A long glutenin chain with intermolecular covalent disulfide bonds. Okay, because gluten is a protein has a bonds, amino acid bonds, disulfide bonds, SH bonds. So small glutenin subunits results into the breaking of the disulfide bonds. Okay, breaking of the disulfide bonds result into the SS linkage, and there are also non-covalent cross links like hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic bonds, and hydrophobic bonds and hydrogen bonds, and there are interaction between these takes place. Sometimes SS linkages there is an interaction so when there is a more interaction, when all of them come together very nicely, beautifully, the dough that is formed is uniform without any cracks. Okay, without any cracks. I will get back to this slide again. So basically, you have a gluten network. You have a gluten network. You don't have a gluten network initially. You develop that gluten network. How do you develop? Is this slide? Yeah. So how do you develop that gluten network? By mixing. So mixing process is very important. So we are going to discuss dough development. How in the dough the development of the gluten or network building takes place. Okay, there are stages of the dough development. The initial stage or the primary stage. The primary action is incorporation of the ingredients. Okay, the dough is initially what happens, you take the wheat flour, you add the water. So when you add the water, how is the dough? The dough is wet. The dough is also very sticky. If you have a not, because I think analysis, food processing subject, practical subject, na this semester, Atharva.
Yes, ma'am. Processing this semester.
You have already done bread baking. You have made a bread already.
Yes.
So you must have experienced when you initial stages, the bread dough is so sticky. It is so wet. You must have already done. So my job is very easy. Then I will not show you the figure or picture or the video. Okay. So then in the second stage, what happens? You keep continuing. You continue to what you do. You continue to knead it. Okay. That process is called as a pickup stage. The ingredients are combined into wet mass. Okay, you are taking the wheat flour, and then you are trying to put the water flour together, and then you are punching with your palm, and then you are mixing. The mass that is there is rough, which is uneven, and it is also wet. It is also sticky. And the gluten is not yet formed. Okay, so in this pickup stage, what happens? The gluten SS and SH linkages try to come together. Gliadin, glutenin comes together the moment you add water, but then they have not developed. They have not formed a strong covalent bonds or strong linkages. So in this punching action or mixing action, the oxygen is needed. The oxygen, in presence of oxygen, these linkages become stronger, and then the gluten structure begins to form. It forms. Okay, so cleanup stage means the developing dough becomes drier, elastic. Now initially, if you observe, the dough is wet, but if you continue to mix the dough, if you continue to incorporate the oxygen or continue to mix the dough, what happens? The dough becomes drier. It becomes more elastic. It becomes, very, very soft, cohesive mass, and it stops sticking. It doesn't stick anymore. I'm sure you must have experienced this while making a bread. Okay, so it doesn't stick at all because it forms a very glossy, very non-sticky dough because of the dough development stage. In the fourth stage or fourth step of the dough development, what happens? The dough is now entirely very elastic. It is drier, and it tears very quickly when stretched. Like you try to stretch the dough, and it easily tears off. The final stage is called as the optimum mixing stage, or optimum or final mixing stage. In this stage, the dough is absolutely silky, very, very smooth, very dry, and it can be molded like anything. It's like very beautiful dough, very elastic, very silky. It forms a very thin semi-transparent membrane. Like if you take and try to stretch it, it forms a very, very good transparent membrane of uniform thickness when stretched. I'm sure you must have tried, and it is so smooth, it is so silky, it is so good in the hand. You try to just stretch it out, it will get extend because of the dough development, because of the gliadin and glutenin. Both of them have that developed a viscoelasticity or elasticity, and the strength is also given. Then further, if you try to mix, what happens? It is called as a let down stage. Dough loses its elastic character. It becomes increasingly softer, smoother. See, now you will wonder, like, how much should one go for the dough mixing? I have a recorded video which I will share. There are various techniques to monitor the dough mixing. There are various instruments that are required to test the dough mixing, like Brabender farinograph, Brabender viscoamylograph, or mixograph. It is just called as a mixograph, and in that machine, in the commercially industrial bakery, these instruments are being used, and these instruments gives an idea whether the dough is mixed properly. Like there are stages, like in Brabender farinograph, it gives you an idea how much water should be added to get an appropriate strong bread. It is called as a dough development time. The machine itself indicates DDT. It is called as a DDT, and there are standards designed or developed by the company. It is called as a dough development time. And then once the industry knows that this much is the dough development time, or this much time I should mix into the mixer or blender the wheat flour, and then after that they remove it. Okay, that is called as a dough development. Dough strength, this much time the dough should be mixed, and it is also has a dough strength. How much is the strength of the dough is decided on the basis of the gluten quality, gluten strength, because every time you receive a different types of wheat flour, it will have a different quantity of gluten or different quality of gluten, and that will decide the gluten strength. So in the commercial scale, these parameters are compulsorily monitored. Okay, if you do excess dough mixing, you will lose the dough gluten strength or the ability or the viscoelasticity of the dough. So dough coherence diminishes and it begins to form a rubbery strand. Like suppose you have to decide whether you want to make a dough bread, or you want to make a donut, or you want to make a croissant, or what is the objective. And each bread or type or each type of food item that is being made has a different mixing. Then the sixth stage is your breakdown stage. Dough mixed beyond the let down stage disintegrates. It becomes slacky. It becomes runny. It becomes again sticky. It becomes moist. It lacks the elasticity. It exhibits poor machining property, and breads from under or over mixed dough show caved inside. So low volume. It gives rise to low volume. It becomes a sticky crumb, and then it doesn't give you an appropriate shape. Okay. So mixing is very important. How do you mix is very important. What type of machines you are going to use is very important. So mixing time depends on various factors such as type of flour. As I mentioned, you are going to use rice flour, a gluten-free bread. The mixing that you don't need a dough development because then there is no gluten. Okay. So type of flour. If you have a hard wheat, the time required will be different. A soft wheat time required will be different because it has a very less gluten. So the dough development time will be quick. If you have a more gluten, the dough development time will be more. Then type of mixer, like if you have a blades which are rotatory blades or sharp blades, or what type of blade, U-shaped blades. So what type of blades? I will be taking that. Speed of mixing, whether you are mixing at a faster rate or a slower rate, that affects on the dough development time. Consistency of the dough. If you pour more water, the dough development will take maybe faster because the dough gets wetted faster. If you put too less water, what will happen? The dough will remain dry, and then the dough may not achieve the appropriate consistency at a faster speed. So mixing time depends on all these factors, whether you have added shortenings, whether you have added salt, what is the point of salt addition? Is it in the first stage or second stage or third stage? What type of additives? If you have added enzyme, because the moment you add enzyme, they are going to start acting during the dough, or acting upon the substrate during the dough mixing. Okay. What is the particle size of the flour? How much is the damaged starch? How much is the flour strength? As I again mentioned, like type of flour will decide the flour strength, which influences the water absorption. Like if you have more protein, more flour is absorbed, more water is absorbed. Sorry. If you have more damaged starch, more water is absorbed. If you have fine flour of the particle of the wheat flour, it will absorb more water because there is more surface area. If you have coarser flour, it will absorb the less moisture, and that is why the mixing time will be different.
Ma'am,
So yes,
ma'am, I have a doubt. Like,
yes,
hello.
yes, please, I'm listening.
So in mixing time, you said more time will be required when there is higher protein content or higher damaged starch, right?
Yes.
So higher damaged starch is undesirable for bread making, right? So how will we determine during bread making that the flour is correct or undesirable?
Very good question. Very nice, excellent question. So basically, damaged starch is, as I mentioned, in certain percentage is desirable. Damaged starch is desirable because it has more OH group or hydroxy, because it's a physically damaged starch, and which results into more like these damaged starch gets easily accessible by the amylase enzyme, and then they gets converted into dextrine and sugar, and then these can be utilized easily by so, and these are natural. Adding sucrose is a different thing as a source of food, and dextrins that are naturally present in the flour. So damaged starch, when they produce dextrine, and then these dextrins have an anti-staling effect. It is proven. Okay. So a miller or a baker decides that how much is the damaged starch content I want, how much of the damaged starch can be handled by my equipments or by my machineries, because damaged starch obviously, because there are more OH groups open, it will lead to water absorption, more water absorption. And then if you have more water absorption, what will happen? It will lead to a sticky dough. It will lead to sticky dough. So a baker decides or sends a message to the miller that I need a wheat flour which has a damaged starch content up to 12%. I can handle that. And generally in the industry, by the commercial milling, this much percentage of damaged starch is produced, and rather it is desirable up to this. But if you go beyond this, the percentage of damaged starch, so this is controlled during the milling by adjusting the aperture between the two rolls, or reducing the heat, because damaged starch could be produced by various ways also. If you want more damaged starch content, so shear forces or the forces during milling could be increased. So this can be modified, the damaged starch content. So this is a desirable, up to this percentage the damaged starch content is desirable in the bread, and a baker can ask for that desirable damaged starch content from a miller. So when you have more damaged starch content, there will be more water absorption, and then accordingly, the baker decides that okay, I have more damaged starch content, I should add less water, because it is going to produce dextrin, and also then other ingredients are also varied. Am I clear with your doubt?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh. So even as a baker, I can tell the miller that I do not want high damage starch content, or suppose I am a chapati manufacturer, so I will request that for chapati even 25% of the damage starch is desirable. So in food chemistry there is a practical called as a damage starch. You must have done that, na? Last year, analysis of damage starch content. So again, the flour particle size, if you have a smaller flour particle size, it absorbs more water and vice versa. So there are a lot of changes that takes place during mixing, and that is why it is very important. As I mentioned before, there is a three-dimensional network of the protein forms from gliadin and lutein, sulfhydryl, disulfide, that is SS and SHS interchange reactions takes place, and there is action that you do, like the punching action that you do. Okay, so what you do, you incorporate, or during the mixing there is an oxygen incorporation into the dough. This oxygen goes and sits, and which helps in the oxidation, which very important, which helps in the oxidation as well as formation of nuclei for the formation of gas cell. Very important step. Okay, very important. So this mixing helps in formation of these nuclei for further formation of the gas cells, or the carbon dioxide should come there and sit so that the gas cells are formed. Starch, lipid, protein complex formation also takes place during this process of mixing, which is also responsible for gas retention during baking. Okay.
Ma'am,
Yes.
what component are we aiming to oxidize?
Sorry.
What component of the dough are we aiming to oxidize?
See, basically here, you have, let me share my another slide. What slide? The So basically, you know, here we are not basically oxidizing completely, but a process in which, you know, oxygen helps in modifying the gluten texture. This previous slide, let me share. So we are, you know, basically incorporating the oxygen to bridge the linkages SH and SS linkages more strongly. How does that happen? Basically, you know, according to various research and studies, so basically, you know, the gluten development mainly involves these gluten proteins that interact with each other in the loop by these disulfide bonds. And at the early stage of mixing, what happens? These gluten fibrils are in contact with these mixer blades, you know, mixing blades, the sides of the bowl and other flour particles. And then you have also added the water. So the hydrated gluten fibrils and starch granules, they are continuously dispersing throughout. And as I mentioned before, the gluten is not present. It has to be developed. So glutenin, which is basically a long polymeric protein that is being folded, and then the chains are, you know, formed in the random orientation. And when you proceed this mixing, more protein becomes hydrated. Glutenin tends to align, and then this gliadin and glutenin comes together. At this stage, the gluten network try to develop by cross-linking of the protein. What is here cross-linking? In this figure, you can see the cross-linking of protein with the disulfide bond. Okay, and then continuously the mixing is happening. The disulfide bonds could be strengthened by addition of oxygen at the linkages. At optimum dough development process, the interaction between the polymers of cross links are becoming stronger and stronger due to the addition of this oxygen. Okay, so when this dough is mixed for a longer time by addition of this oxygen, further, you know, further if you try to mix, what happens? The cross links begins to break down due to the breakage of these disulfide bonds. Okay, so that is why, as I mentioned, the